Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our 84th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. We've been meeting since for almost 2 years now, getting on for that, since that's been the length of the pandemic. And as I've always said, so long as there's a demand and a supply, I'm quite happy to be the go-between. And so we'll keep on meeting. It's really good to have Johan Rewilak from Aston Business School talking today on mega events, a well-timed Roses event, given that the Winter Olympics opening ceremony took place early on today. Maybe it's even ongoing. But we've got a Festival of Sport, a mega event taking place at the moment. And by and large, we as economists have never been particularly hot about the positive effects of mega events. And so Johan's going to present some interesting, hot off the press research this afternoon. Before he does that, I just wanted to flag up a couple of calls for papers, since we can do that. And there are some conferences on the way, planned to be in person. Some of you will have seen the call for papers for the European Sports Economics Association Conference 2022, which is 24th to 26th of August and is in Helsinki. And I will share a link to the call for papers in the chat. I'm just having a quick check. Yep, submit abstracts by March the 31st. So we've still got a couple of months in which to get those abstracts ready. The other call for papers is the 16th Johan Conference in Sports Economics. And if you didn't get your fix of Johan a couple of months ago in December, you've got another chance in May the 6th and the 7th, the 16th Johan Conference in Sport Economics, in memory of Stefan Kassen. And again, I'll share information about that in the chat as we get going. But I don't want to take up any more of Johan's time. So please, Johan, go ahead and take away your presentation.
Sure thing. So thank you very much for the invitation, James, and thank you very much for all of you for attending, especially those over in North America, where I know it's 9:30 and I know that my voice isn't the best thing to start your Friday morning with, or start the weekend with. So in terms of this paper, I'll just give you a brief outline of where it is. So I started doing something around late summer with this and put together a very sketchy draft in September, October time for the Sport Management Australia and New Zealand conference, which gave me 10 minutes to present some results. And since then, James invited me to present this, and I thought, okay, the end of February gives me 2 months to sit down and actually get on with this paper. And I was naive in my thoughts, thinking that I actually would do this. So days became weeks, weeks became months, and then what we have here basically are some results hot off the press, where you can still smell the statter on them, is probably the best way to put it. Given this, there's quite a few results here. Any feedback in terms of what's important? I've probably overlooked quite a lot of things here as well. So any comments in terms of where to take this further and actually get a proper draft in future would be very most welcome. So as you can see from the title, I'm looking at some positive economic effects from hosting sporting mega events. And then there's a kind of little column there saying booking the trend of a question mark. And that's basically for us to debate later on. So look at this in terms of the paper is that it's kind of trying to take us in a new direction. Whether I've managed to get something relatively meaningful here, we can debate that until the cows come home, actually, because I'll be very honest and transparent here about some of the holes we have, but hopefully it moves us somewhere else where we can move on to and try and perfect this kind of literature in future. So just to start off, apologies for those who already are aware of all these things, but a sporting mega event is a one-time international scale sporting occasion. And that's how it's defined by Preuss and Zollberg. I think, okay, a one-time international scale sporting occasion is a little bit sketchy, given that we normally find it's the same countries or the same cities that are repeatedly hosting these kind of events. So the classic example we can look at is Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics in 2008, and just over a decade later, they're hosting the Winter Games. Okay. Some additional characteristics of sporting mega events is that they rotate host locations. In addition, they have a formal bidding process, and they last a set prolonged period of time. So the Olympic Games are a couple of weeks, whilst if you look at the FIFA Men's World Cup, that is typically around a month altogether where this event takes place. In terms of sporting mega events, they're typically expensive to host. And some statistics that I have to hand are that the Rio de Janeiro Olympic Games, Summer Olympics in 2016, cost just over $11 billion. And the Japan 2020 delayed Tokyo Olympics were $12 billion forecast in 2019. And I think the actual evidence now suggests, given the delays with coronavirus, this exceeds $15 billion in terms of hosting this specific event. Now, most of these sporting mega events are funded by the taxpayer. There are kind of private investment going on, and a good example here is to look at the Birmingham Commonwealth Games occurring this year, actually, this July, August. So whilst the Birmingham Commonwealth Games only costing £800 million, which is far lower than what the Olympic Games and so forth or World Cups cost, there's £25 million shortfall of funding from private investors, which again is going to be picked up by the taxpayer if no one steps forward to do this. So they are quite expensive to host, and it's typically the population within that country or that pays for such an event. Okay. In terms of sporting mega events, going a bit broader than just in terms of economics, there's a large focus on the legacy effects that occur from hosting a sporting mega event, and predominantly these look at ex post the event, so after the game. So did we establish a long-term tourist industry from hosting, or did we actually enhance cultural understanding from hosting these this sporting mega event? And in terms of legacy effects, I'm going to focus specifically on just maybe some of the economic ones. I'm going to kind of ignore the cultural and social ones, but I just want to make it clear that we can actually try and quantify if there were any cultural or social benefits, and typically your willingness to pay literature and so forth can do that, but I'm just going to try and focus a bit more purely on the economic stuff. So in terms of the motivation for this work, you've noticed, if you look at the data in terms of who's bid for hosting sporting mega events, specifically, say, the Summer Olympics, the number of bidders have reduced over time. And why is that the reason? Well, one thing you could say is that it is quite expensive, and as sports economists, we say actually there are limited economic benefits from hosting, and if there are any economic benefits, they're very short lasting. So the number of bidders has reduced over time, and what we've witnessed is typically it's the same countries or the same host cities that are bidding repeatedly to host these sporting mega events. As I've mentioned, in terms of the actual literature on sporting mega events, we find that actually what boosters say, so people who claim that it's going to have a high economic benefit or a high economic impact from hosting a sporting event, whether it's mega or minor, or for example, just a one-off event such as a Super Bowl, they claim that the sums that you'll receive are huge. Sports economists contrast that and say, actually, the benefits are far less. I don't think Victor's here today, so I'm sure he won't mind me coining this. I call it the Matheson decimal point, because he repeatedly says that whatever the boosters tell you is going to be the economic impact, move the decimal point one place to the left. So if they say it's going to be $100 million, it's more likely to be $10 million. And if it's going to be $10 million that the boosters claim, it's more likely to be $1 million. Okay. Now, why is there such a discrepancy in these figures? Well, one thing is you can talk about there's maybe just difficulties in calculating the economic benefits, okay? But that should affect our impact, both the calculations for the boosters and the calculations for our sports economists. Alternatively, and this is where this kind of paper starts to move on to, is are we examining the correct places? So this is a bit of this kind of grey area. Are the boosters actually right and are we wrong? Or are we right and are the boosters wrong? Okay. And what this paper tries to do, it tries to seek areas of the economy which are previously unexplored or have had far less attention provided to them in terms of finding some economic benefits, but likewise in future we could also say maybe there are costs that we've not actually looked at whilst looking at these areas of the economy as well. Okay. So in terms of the research question, it's quite straightforward, and it's basically looking at, does hosting a sporting mega event provide any economic benefits to the host? Okay. And what I do specifically is I look at the industrial sector or the manufacturing sector. And the research question is, more granularly, do industrial firms in host nations increase their pre-tax profits relative to their size as a result of hosting a sporting mega event? Okay. Moving on, I also try and focus on some supply chain considerations. Okay. And this is basically looked upon in terms of that when we have a sporting mega event occurring, there's normally one dominant or several dominant contractors who are allocated the rights to build the final infrastructure, such as the stadia or the athlete villages or certain infrastructure projects. We're not going to go down the road in terms of whether those decisions are politically motivated or not, but typically a select number of firms get a wide portion of those contracts or a large amount of those contracts. Okay. But it'd be very naive to say that that individual firm or those individual firms have A, all the resources freely available, and B, have the expertise to actually manufacture every single thing that encompasses building this infrastructural development. So a good example would be, if you want to build an event stadia, you also need to fill it with seats. And a lot of these seats might need a plastic polymer to be manufactured, and then the seats will be delivered for final assembly. Likewise, for all the floodlights, you're going to need masses and masses of electrical cable. It's very rare that the firm that's actually building the stadium is also going to be building and supplying the cables as a result of manufacturing the plastic for the chairs and putting it all together. Typically, what will happen is these roles will be subcontracted elsewhere in the economy, or elsewhere globally, should I say, to other firms. So looking at these supply chain considerations, when are these benefits greater? And so we look at, do these benefits differ based upon trade openness? And what you can look at here is basically, if the preferred measure is looking at how many manufactured goods a nation imports from abroad. So the easy example here is looking at the United Kingdom. We got rid of most of our manufacturing here in the United Kingdom. If the United Kingdom were going to hold a sporting mega event, okay, it's hard to argue that the final construction is not going to occur in Birmingham with the Commonwealth Games, but many of these inputs actually might be imported from France and, say, Germany. So that's where the economic benefits spread. However, if the United Kingdom was manufacturing a lot of its own products, then maybe the benefits would stay within the economy's borders. So the second part of the question we're looking at is whether or not do these economic benefits differ based upon how open a nation is to trade. In terms of the punchline, I'm going to give you the conservative estimates here, is that hosting a sporting mega event can increase pre-tax profits to total assets by 0.6 percentage points. That is quite an economically significant effect, given the mean value in the sample is that pre-tax profits are 4% of total assets. So you're talking quite an economically significant amount. I want it to be very clear, though, that when we look at the government, obviously the government will tax these firms. It's not a case that they're going to be getting all this back from themselves. So even though we might find some positive economic benefits, it's probably highly unlikely that they're going to pay for all the amount of money that's gone into investing in this event. And the second result, the second punchline here is that the effect vanishes in more open economies. So those who have a high intensity to import manufactured goods, they don't get this benefit whatsoever. Moving on in terms of the existing literature on economic impact on sports, I know there's a new paper that's come out by Dennis and Brad, I think they're in the audience, so don't worry, I will be popping you into the revised manuscript eventually. So what we have is typically a focus on the service sector or the tourism sector. Okay, so in terms of just sporting contests, Dennis has done some work there on received taxable sales. Craig Depkin's done stuff in terms of hotel occupancy and stuff on fast food sales from specific events which may occur annually, such as the Indy 500. But what we were trying to differentiate here is that ignoring all the displacement and substitution effects that you find here, sporting mega events are much larger in scale than just typical one-off sporting contests. So whilst we've got the Super Bowl occurring, is it this weekend, I think? Yeah, I think it is this weekend. Whilst the Super Bowl's occurring this weekend, you can have lots of fans going to the host city, and the host city has not had to actually improve its infrastructure so much to just host this specific event. Now, in terms of sporting mega events, even if you are quite a dominant destination, you still are probably told to develop your infrastructure. And the good example here is looking at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. So despite Rio de Janeiro having an abundance of hotels, all those beachside cabanas and everything, and having a large international airport, they were still required to build an extra 15,000 hotel rooms just to host the Olympic Games. And they were further told to keep developing the infrastructure. Nevertheless, when we focus on the economic impact of sporting mega events, there still is that excessive focus on the service sector, focusing on tourism and hospitality. And that actually does make conceptual sense, because it's typically sports tourists who come in and actually increase their spending during the event window, and the focus on legacy effects means that we're looking at whether or not these hosting sporting mega event led to these legacy effects and a long-term tourism strategy was developed. Okay. There are a number of studies at the aggregate level, looking at whether or not trade to GDP increases over time, whether GDP increases over time from hosting. And I'm just not going to go into the literature specifically, but we've got two great papers there by Rosenspiegel in the J and Billings and Holiday in Economic Inquiry that outline these effects. Okay. However, when we're looking at these aggregate level studies, they don't isolate the industrial sector. They focus on the economy overall, which would be the industrial sector and the service sector together. So one thing how I'm trying to place myself here is I'm trying to strip out the service sector and other elements and focus exclusively just on industry. Now, in a nutshell, focusing at all these economic impact and sports studies, as I previously mentioned, typically we find that there is a very limited effect, if there is any effect whatsoever. Now, moving on to the Exante literature. Now, if we look at the event window of hosting a sporting mega event, you have three distinct periods. You have from being announced that you've won the rights to host this event up to the event itself. You have the event window, the 2 weeks or the month where you're hosting this event, and then you have the period after the event itself. Now, typically the ex ante literature is far less studied than the event window or the ex post literature. But there has been stuff done from the stock market which helps motivate this work. So in particular, we find that stock prices on indexes of winning bidders increase when they announce they have won the rights to host a sporting mega event, specifically the Olympic Games in this example. And from all the sectors, it's the construction sector that receives the largest boost. So they have the largest price rises. And this is obviously quite sensible, because given in the run up to the games, we're going to have a lot of infrastructural development where these construction firms are going to be active and engaging in manufacturing this new infrastructure. What I want to make sure, though, and try and outline is that whilst only several firms may be listed on the exchange rate, this study now tries to place itself a bit more by looking at whether or not we have these concepts can be generalized more generically in the economy. In addition, there are some studies at the aggregate level that focus on the ex ante impact from hosting. For example, we have evidence that GDP growth does increase for winning bidders in the run up to the event. But just like the studies prior, they don't strip out the service sector or other sectors, or say even the agricultural sector, for example, from the calculations themselves. So this is where this paper kind of places itself in. So I'm going to focus specifically on the neglected industrial sector exclusively. And it's motivated by a paper that Ted Haydock and I wrote in recently, based on the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, where we looked at the construction of the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, and we found that most of the manufacturing of most of the inputs for the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing were created in Shanghai. So if you're looking at this, the host city wouldn't get any disproportional benefits relative to Shanghai, but the benefits will be flowing still around the borders of China. So in addition, we look at the timing effects. So we add to this Exante literature, but rather than looking at the aggregate level, we drop down to the firm level effects. So combined, they fill this kind of research gap, which in future I'm hoping would allow us to put greater focus on supply chains. So this is where I'd like to see this literature potentially go in future, where if we're focused on the industrial sector, rather than looking at things in aggregate, heavy, bulky ways, we start to look at these supply chains and see where these benefits disappear, whether they remain within a country's borders or whether they spill over further away. And the results probably have some important implications for policy, because if we find an area which has been previously neglected that showcases economic benefits, if you are a policymaker who's deciding whether or not to perform some cost benefit analysis to make a decision whether you're going to bid to host the games, this may influence your decisions potentially. And as we've mentioned, the number of hosts the number of countries bidding to be hosts of sports and mega events is diminishing. Potentially, this may reinvigorate a few more hosts to decide they want to do this. Okay. So this is where things get a bit interesting. So moving on to the empirical strategy, I focus specifically on a Rosenspiegel 2011 model where we focus on an indicator variable that basically switches on when a country has won the rights to win a host through to the event year itself. Okay. Now looking at the equation at the top, our dependent variable y is just going to be firm level pre-tax profits. Okay. So we're going to look at the firm level and see whether or not pre-tax profits increased from hosting a sporting mega event. Why am I focusing on pre-tax profits? Because I'm using 18 different countries throughout the world, so firms from 18 different countries, and given that there are different accounting laws within these jurisdictions, it's hopefully going to, especially in terms of carrying over tax losses and so forth, hopefully it'll give us a cleaner measure rather than a post-tax measure. In robustness tests, I also use return on assets here, and return on assets and pre-tax profits are quite highly correlated. I believe it's say 0.9, I believe. So the findings are transferable here. The next thing I just want to quickly get your attention to is I look at the dependent variable lag run period. Initially, I'm going to set that gamma coefficient to equal 0, so that term would disappear. But that's just to show something that potentially future profits may be dictated by past profits. So if a firm is profitable in a previous period, it may reinvest those profits to become more profitable in the future period. Then the key variable of interest is this OG variable with the lambda coefficient, which is just an indicator function which turns itself on as a 1 if a country wins the rights to host a sporting mega event and 0 otherwise. There are two types of control variables in matrices X1 and X2. So in matrix X1, I believe on the next slide I'll go through those, are the firm level controls, and in matrix X2 are our country level controls. In addition, we control for all time invariant unobservables at the firm level, and we control for time fixed effects, which are common for all firms in all countries. Now, in terms of the identification assumption, it's very strong. So Rosenspiegel do this at the country level. I'm moving this down to the firm level, so a lower level of aggregation. And it assumes that firms in unsuccessful bidders are similar to firms in hosts in terms of their pre-tax profits, conditional on firm and country characteristics in these matrices above, and they only differ by the experience of hosting an SME. Okay, if you dangle this in front of me and you were presenting and I was in the audience, I'd say, yeah, you're hanging on by a thread here. This is a little bit far-fetched. But looking at the data and looking at the types of countries that we have in the sample, and because we're focusing exclusively on industrial firms, I like to look at this a bit more in terms of a glass half full kind of situation. So in terms of the countries that are bidding for these sporting mega events, they're typically very homogeneous in type. So you've got a lot of Western European countries, many developed countries. Okay. So in terms of an industrial firm in, say, France, I'd anticipate that industrial firm in France should be pretty close or pretty similar in terms of its characteristics to a firm, say, in Germany or in Italy, give or take. Okay. Now, I believe that if I was focusing on the entire economy, so I was comparing, say, a high-tech firm in Japan with an industrial firm in France, then this assumption is clearly going to be violated very easily. Likewise, if I was looking at industrial firm in Cameroon versus an industrial firm in, say, the United Kingdom, again, this might become quite violated. So what else has been done here is when we look at peer effect, we're looking at peer groups and peer observations when we're trying to group these firms together. There's a lot of firms that actually are matched across borders as well, and across borders in terms of these European countries. So if I was going to do some analysis of on the stock price of a French industrialist, I might pick some French firms which I would put in the peer group, but likewise I'd also maybe go outside the borders of France and choose some German firms and so forth. So I don't think this is as far-fetched as it initially appears, given the sample of countries used in this, and given that we are limiting this to specifically industrial firms. In terms of the data, I use firm-level data from the database Orbis over the period 2008 to 2018 inclusive. So I've got 11 years of data here. There's 18 countries that I use, and I've mentioned most of them are Western developed countries. And we have one or two outliers. I'll talk about that shortly. And in total, we have just over 16,000 industrial firms available. And the country selection are those who have bid for a Summer Olympic Games or a FIFA Men's World Cup. Okay. Now, I've stripped out other large or what could be perceived as sporting mega events such as the Winter Games, Winter Olympic Games, and also, for example, maybe the Women's World Cup, purely for the reason that these two specific sporting mega events attract the most attention worldwide in terms of media interest. They have also a large amount of nation participants in them. So the FIFA World Cup has at least 32 different nations attending, even though all nations in the world try and qualify for this. The Summer Olympic Games, of course, we know how large in magnitude they are. I've already mentioned about the host effect. What I will mention, though, is in some robustness tests to outline the importance of looking at this ex-ante effect, I changed this dummy variable to equal just 1 for the event year itself, and it's 0 all other times, and we see something interesting when we do this. In terms of the control variables used in matrices X1 and X2, many of the firm level controls are controlling for its fixed assets, the leverage of the firm, revenue, its current ratio, its size by total assets in some robustness tests. Then at the country level, we control for the growth of a nation, how much a government's spending, its openness, and its macroeconomic stability, proxied by the inflation rate. So we have both country and firm level control variables in there. And then later on, when we start to split the sample by trade openness, we have 3 different measures. So the first is simply using the traditional measure in terms of trade openness, exports and imports divided by GDP. Now, this could be a bit of a flawed measure. Why could that be? Because obviously you could export lots of goods and import very few, and you could be defined as a high or a nation which is very open to trade. So in further tests, we just limit this to imports to GDP. So we've seen how we try and split the sample based on how much you import. But then, of course, this may have some further problems as well, in the sense that I could import very few manufactured goods, but import lots of raw materials and lots of service sector products, again, it may misclassify me. So finally, we focus on manufacturing imports as a percentage of GDP. So we're splitting nations based on how much they import, how many manufactured goods they import. So a few threats to identification which add on to what we already have. So as most databases, as time progresses, more and more new firms enter the database. And this could probably have some problems with our estimates, because typically new firms and younger firms are less profitable than established firms. I think there's a statistic that pretty much 1 in 3, I believe, of new firms actually die out. Okay. So how do we avoid this? Well, what we try and do is we limit the sample to include only countries who enter the database in 2008. So we don't allow any new firms to enter the sample as a robustness test. In terms of survivorship bias and attrition, there isn't much of a problem in the sample, because I believe it's only, say, 3% of the firms die out from the sample, and they die out naturally due to liquidation. And then there's maybe an overall underrepresentation of some dominant nations from the Orbis database. So for some reason, Italy has a lot of industrial firms in the database. So as a robustness test, we remove Italy from the analysis, so we move down to less nations, and we also get rid of some of the less developed countries that have bid for the Olympic Games, such as Brazil. So we remove those from the sample. So that's one of the aspects of one of the threats to identification, how we try and overcome that. The second is links to the identification assumption. If you still believe that I am comparing apples and oranges, I use coarse and exact matching to try and make sure that we actually are comparing apples and apples. So what coarse and exact matching does is it creates over multiple dimensions a grid-like procedure of various strata. So I'm going to outline the simple case. So imagine a noughts and crosses board or a tic-tac-toe board if you're from North America. Now you've got 9 squares, and in those 9 squares you would have your control group and your treated units spread throughout. Let's assume in the top left you have lots of control units and no treated units. Well, what coarse and exact matching does, it just gets rid of that entire set of data. Let's assume on the bottom right, we've got lots of treated units, but no control units. Coarse and exact matching gets rid of all that data. So it only keeps data within where there are both control units and treated units within that specific strata. So what it does is very data intensive, but by being so data intensive, it ensures that you've got the best possible matches based on your criteria. And of course, we've thought about this in a 2-dimensional case using a tic-tac-toe board, but every other variable that you condition on, you're going to start adding an extra dimension and add an extra strata. As we see when we go and talk about the results later on, we lose quite a lot of the database, even if we only condition on a few variables. So it just shows how strong this works in terms of matching. And there are some final additional econometric considerations that we thought about. Here is in terms of that, how do firm financials coincide with annual data? And what I mean by this is, it's a situation where you have a financial year that might end up being part of the next calendar year. So if your accounts are due from March, say 2021 through to March 2022, but then we've got economic growth for 2021 or 2022, however it's going to be done, we have this kind of distinction between one calendar year and one financial year. So to try and overcome this problem where we're actually misaligned, we've lagged the firm financials and actually lagged all the control variables by one period to try and make sure we actually have something stronger there. And it's not done as a specific endogeneity fix in terms of trying to use lag values to try and get a causal estimate. That's not what I'm doing here. It's just purely to try and help this coincide with an annual year and a financial year. And then in addition, looking about persistence. So what I do to control for persistence here is that I use a system GMM estimator. And why I'm using a system GMM estimator because obviously what we have here is we've got a panel system, we've got large n and small t, so that's what the estimator is designed for. And likewise, rather than just doing a fixed effects estimate of a lag dependent variable, I am worried about nickel bias since I've only got 11 time periods. That would mean my bias could be 9%, hence why I'm using the system GMM estimator. So in these estimates, we're actually setting gamma to be positive, or assuming gamma is non-zero, should I say, from the previous estimated equation. And some final econometric considerations are that the standard errors are clustered at the firm level. Okay, now when we're looking at policy or we're looking at shocks that occur at the country level, in particular when we look at the financial and banking literature, this is quite common that we still hold us or control our standard errors at the firm level. So an example could be looking at whether or not negative interest rate policies from central banks had an impact on bank stability. We'd control our standard errors at the bank. That's typically done in the literature. But there is some problem or some concern that the errors at the country level may be correlated over time. Now, there is a problem here in terms of this data set, since we've only got 18 different countries. And if you read Angrist and Pishka, which I think is one of the Bibles, they say that the rule of thumb is to have at least 40 or 50 clusters if you want to actually cluster at that specific level. So this is just done as a robustness test, and you'll see the results shortly. Just checking how I'm doing for time. So I think I'm probably just about good here. So let's look at some baseline results. So this is what is the kind of the benchmarking estimates that I'm finding. So in what I'd like to report here is just the host effect coefficient. Just trust me when I say this, that all the other coefficients, all the other variables are included in this regression. And what we have here is in the very first standard benchmark estimate in our first column, we have a host effect of 0.62, okay, or 0.63. And what we have then, we're moving on throughout this table, is we just try and play around with the sample and see what impact it has on terms of the coefficient and what impact it actually has on the variable itself. So in the following column, when we still have no restrictions on the database, we lag our firm financials and our control variables to try and avoid this calendar year and financial year. And we notice that we still get some host effect evidence. Now, you're talking the 10% significance level. I've got 72,000 observations. So this is why we've got this question mark in the title. Are we actually finding something here or not? In the next two columns of the results, we still find a positive and statistically significant host effect. And what we do here is we create some restrictions on the firms in the database. So what we do in columns 3 and 4 is a situation we only include firms that were in the sample from 2008 onwards. Now, I know you might say that, okay, new firms entering could be an economic benefit of hosting SME if it encourages entrepreneurship and so forth. But in these columns 3 and 4, we try and make sure that we only have those firms that were in the sample at the beginning, and we don't allow firms to enter throughout. And what we notice actually is that, as we probably expect, younger firms are typically less profitable. So potentially this is why we might see a slightly larger coefficient in terms of the host effect. Again, lagging those control variables, it goes for significance falls to the 10% level. And then the final two columns places even more restrictions on the sample size. So not only do we have firms who enter the sample in 2008, but we also remove 6 countries from the analysis, and they are Italy, Brazil, Hungary, Qatar, Russia, and Turkey. So these countries are over or underrepresented in the sample, and a lot of those other countries, for example, if you're looking at, say, Hungary and Turkey, potentially Russia as well, and Brazil, they're more or less economically developed than the standard countries that we have in the data set, such as such as your France's, your Germany's, your Italy's, United Kingdom, and so forth. So we try and make the sample a lot more homogeneous there, and we still find that even under full restrictions, we have a positive and significant coefficient in both cases, and when we lag the control variables, we still get a significant effect, and that's at the 5% level here. So those are the benchmark estimates. So that's kind of question 1, or what the first thing we'll look at. The second thing we like to look at is that do these effects differ by trade openness? So we have three columns again, sorry, three main kind of 6 columns highlighted by 3 main kind of strata. So the first is focusing when we look at the splitting the sample by trade openness. So how we split the sample is we look at the median value. Of course, we're not going to have balanced observations because this data is at the country level rather than the individual firm level. So what we find is firms in countries that have low trade openness have a positive host effect, but industrial firms who have a trade openness in the higher end of the sample have an insignificant effect from hosting a sporting mega event. Now, we mentioned that trade openness may be a loaded measure, so we replicate the exercise looking at import intensity. As we mentioned as well, the pattern still emerges, albeit at the 10% level. Then we know full well that import intensity still may be a loaded metric, so we're looking at the manufacturing import intensity. So the final 2 columns here are the columns that I'm really most interested in. Okay, and what we show is that firms in the sample, for firms who belong in a country who has a manufacturing import intensity in the lower half of the sample, they have a positive economic benefit, and those in the higher end have 0 economic benefit, which is quite an interesting finding and kind of backs up this idea about the supply chains working through. Now, before I move on quickly to some robustness tests, I did try and split this a little bit more in terms of, say, quartiles or so forth. This result holds in the lower quartile, so I'm pretty happy with that, and actually increasing magnitude. But in terms of rather than disaggregating the sample, because obviously I'll be only 18 countries, I'm already splitting this by kind of 9 and 9 effectively. I don't want to be disaggregating that further, so this is why I prefer just to split by the median. Moving on to some robustness testing. This is where we start to play around with the specification and change a few things around. So examining just the host effect, focusing only in the event year. So the first column here, rather than having a dummy variable for the host effect from the time that the winning bid is announced all the way through to and including the event year, column 1 just focuses on the dummy switching on during the event year itself. We'd hope to see an insignificant coefficient, and we do, which again shows that there is this importance of looking at these ex-ante benefits in greater detail. The second column there starts to add an extra conditioning variable into the specification, which is firm size. And then the third column there looks at a post-tax profit measure, so looking at return on assets rather than pre-tax profits. As mentioned, they're highly correlated with one another, and we still see this positive and statistically significant effect. Column 4 is what I'd like to draw most attention to. Actually, that's the old, actually there were 2 columns here beforehand. I'll tell you, the observations here are actually 45,000, rather than 5,000. But in this coefficient here, it increases quite significantly. And what we do here is we try and compare apples and apples rather than potentially apples and oranges. And how we match on economic growth, we match on government spending, we match on various covariates from the first stage to see whether or not we've got firms that are very similar and to one another, only differing by being in a country that hosts a sporting mega event rather than it doesn't. Now, I've done several of these Corson matching estimates whereby, of course, the more dimensions you match on, the less observations you get. So this actually, the 5,000 observations is when you match on every single covariate apart from government spending. Once you actually match on government spending as well, you get less than 1% of the sample remaining, and the coefficients, of course, start to blow up a little bit. But this hopefully should still convince us that what we have before here may be potentially credible. And then the final 3 columns, these are the coefficients you've already seen before, but they just cluster the standard errors at the country level. So in terms of the full sample, it just misses out on statistical significance at the 10% level. But then again, of 87,000 observations, whether that's a good thing or not, actually, I suppose it's probably not. But the important finding is this second low openness column. We have even clustering at the country level. So we're only using, say, 9 clusters rather than the 18, which is way lower than the 40 or 50 recommended, we still find a statistically significant effect here. And in terms of the final set of robustness tests, I know I'm starting to eat a bit of time here, James, is that we start to look at persistence. And if we use the system GMM estimates, whether or not we still actually find a positive effect. And as before, all the covariates are still included in the specification. Everything is instrumented using the estimator's internal instrumental variable strategy. We see with lag profit that controlling for dynamics is important, and as predicted, previous period profits influence subsequent period profits as well. And just like before, when we're looking at the full sample and when we're looking at the sample containing only firms in nations that are of a low propensity to import manufactured goods, we find a positive host effect. In terms of nations that are open to trade, we find an insignificant effect. So moving on to a few conclusions. Do we buck the trend? Are there some positive economic benefits? Well, the results say that potentially they are, but as I mentioned beforehand, it's how you look at these kind of identification strategy used. Is it a glass half full or is it glass half empty? Again, what can I potentially do to make this more robust would be very interesting to find out. But even if these are positive economic benefits that we found and you buy these results, do these values offset the huge sums of hosting? And I'm probably going to say no, they don't, because the focus is on pre-tax profits. Okay, now the government's not going to be getting all this money back from these pre-tax profits because the marginal tax rate is rarely 100%. Add on to the fact that a lot of the big firms who are operating here may be international in nature, and by transfer pricing, profits can easily get remitted from one jurisdiction to the next. In terms of the supply chains, however, this is probably less likely, given that you'd have smaller firms down the supply chain where profits may be more likely to stay in a country. And this is, again, I'm trying to highlight the importance to maybe move in a direction to look at these supply chains in future research. The results remain largely consistent under several different robustness tests, but they do rely on a very strong identification assumption, and whether or not you are willing to buy that, it's up to you guys. Any feedback on that would be very warranted. And in terms of final remarks, because I know I am mindful of time here, it's important to pay greater attention to the industrial sector when focusing on sporting mega events and whether we can find or derive any economic benefits. More important, it's important to focus on the entire event window, so the ex-ante period to the games, not just during the games and after the games. And again, I've highlighted that supply chains appear to be important. And this is a platform for future research where if we can, I know Bloomberg software actually has who are suppliers of certain firms, and they kind of have this kind of network analysis data. That'd be something interesting to maybe look for in future. And I'd hope that the findings have important policy implications in terms of that if we have found something useful here, does it actually bridge the gap between those booster estimates and what us sports economists say? It also shows that the product market openness is very important in whether you will derive these economic benefits. And it also suggests that we should have a more detailed look where these benefits and costs may arise from hosting. I specifically look at the industrial sector, but this is just one hidden aspect of a larger agenda. And I know it's Friday afternoon for all those in the UK, and you've probably got a weekend to enjoy. So I'm happy to go for questions, James.
Okay, thanks very much, Johan. A really interesting talk. I think very thought-provoking, and we've got plenty of time for questions and comments. So if people have any questions and comments, please do raise your hands and go ahead. Dennis.
So, Johan, I've got a lot of questions and comments. I will I'll just ask one to begin and then let other people go at it. So my big question is really about the data. and many of my questions flow from that. You have a variety of results related to trade openness, and you gave 3 different measures of this openness.
Yep.
What I didn't see anywhere was anything related to which countries were more open to trade than others. And that becomes important because you pitch out what I would think are probably a couple, at least, of the least open to trade, and your results look different.
Okay.
So I'd like you to comment on that.
Sure thing. So that's actually a really good point, and that's probably going to be the first thing I'm probably going to put in a table in terms of who is in which kind of category in terms of which strata. If I'm completely honest, I think I definitely need to do that and see. I believe it's the one where we start to kick out those countries which are over and under dominated in the sample, and I know what you're saying there is that they're probably the ones that I'm kicking out to start with in those results are the ones that are probably going to be less open to trade. Is that what you're trying to get at? Yeah. I'm going to have to go into the data and just double check to see where the split is, who's in which area. So in terms of comments, yeah, I don't think there really is a really response. I'm going to do that. That's really interesting. That'll be very helpful.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. Stefan.
Hi, Johan. So you really put your head in the mouth of the lion here, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
this would be the greatest survival act if you can get away with this. I will have to say that. So I'm just going to go at a very small, a sort of really not related to the sports thing at all, but just think about your dependent variable, pre-tax profits.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-tax profits are a really poor indicator of economic activity, I would have thought. So firstly, one way to increase pre-tax profits would be to cut workers' wages. So maybe what happens is when you're hosting a mega sporting event, the government cracks down on unions, wages are driven down, and firms make bigger profits. I mean, I'm being facetious, obviously, but pre-tax profits doesn't tell you really anything about the or very little about the overall economy, and much more even when you think amongst capitalists, the owners are only one side of the firm, right? You also have the financing of the firm that comes through debt, and that's not covered in pre-tax profits because pre-tax profits are declared after interest payments have been deducted. So there's all the question of how capital investors in capital are doing in general, rather than just those who happen to be shareholders. So this is a story of this is good for shareholders, and I'm not sure why we should see that. A much more natural measure, of course, is value added. That's what one would normally think of as being the natural measure of economic activity deriving from something like that. And I think, and I realize that there are probably huge data problems with getting value added, but that doesn't really excuse the fact that pre-tax profit is not value added.
Okay, that's great, Stefan. Actually, I'm glad you actually said the economic value added there, because I should be able to do that. So if I remember my corporate finance from say 2006, I can use return on assets, which we actually have the data for, which showed that multiplying that by the firm's size, the difference or a change should actually give us the EVA calculation, I believe. So yeah, that's a change in dependent variable, and that's a really good point. I'll do that, as maybe even change the whole variables based on that. Thank you very much for that. So that should be possible. So hopefully in the next draft you might see EVA.
There you go. That saves you one bite.
Great. Thanks, Stefan. More questions and comments? Dennis.
Well, if nobody else is going to, I will come back for another shot. In one way, your main result doesn't strike me as terribly surprising in a sense. And so I'm going to put it into a different kind of a context. You have massive government spending, building stadiums and so on. You would expect there to be, as long as you have some sort of Keynesianism in your background, a multiplier effect, right?
Yeah.
And so perhaps what you're finding is a little bit of this multiplier effect, perhaps. And then you open it to trade openness and you say, aha, we are going to be concerned about the countries that are most open to trade, and